Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all again, some new faces. We are going to start our second talk for this afternoon. I'm Carissa Pastic, a reference librarian in the Geography and Map Division. And it's my pleasure to welcome you, those of us in person and online, to the Library of Congress 2024 Philip Lee Phillips Society Spring Presentation, co-sponsored by the Washington Map Society. Our next speaker is Max Edelson. He is a professor of history at the University of Virginia, where he co-directs the UVA Early American Seminar. His current research examines geographic knowledge, map-making, and colonialization in 17th century America. He designed Map Scholar, a web app for historic map visualization, and is developing digital projects focused on UVA's Seymour I. Schwartz collection of North American maps. The presentation will be titled Catawba Cartographies, Remapping the Indigenous Southeast, circa 1670 to 1733. I'm going to give you a brief summary. English colonizers arrived in Kiowa, the Indian region of the southeastern coast of North America in 1670. To promote their new colony, the Lord Proprietors of Carolina commissioned maps to proclaim English sovereignty, attract colonists, and reveal indigenous people and places beyond the Atlantic coast. The view of the native world presented on these maps was deeply distorted. This lecture makes a case that the Catawba deerskin map sought to correct errors observed on English cartography and suggest a new political geography for the region. So now I'd like to welcome Max Edelson.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I want to thank Ron Grimm and everyone at the Philip Lee Phillips Society and the Washington Map Society for having me here today. I just want to start by saying how appreciative I am of the Library of Congress, especially its Geography and Map Division. When I started as a scholar, I was really trained as an economic historian and as an environmental historian. My first book was on South Carolina's plantation economy, which I'm kind of returning to in this talk. And when it was time to write my second book, I applied for and I received a Kislak Fellowship that gave me a year, a sabbatical year here at the library. And I became a map historian looking at the collections at the Library of Congress and then going to the manuscript room and looking up all the people I had studied in the map room. It was such a rich and wonderful place to learn map history. I'm delighted to be back to share some of my new research with you today. This is an image of the Catawba deerskin map, and you can see the actual copy out in our reception area. It is one of the few surviving maps created by Native Americans during the era of colonization. What you're seeing on the screen is a digital image of the Library of Congress's paper copy that's next door, which is a copy of another paper copy that is held by the British Library. The original deerskin map does not seem to be extant. A contemporary annotation on the map describes the original. It was drawn and painted on a deerskin by a native leader and presented to Francis Nicholson, Esquire, governor of South Carolina, where he served from 1721 to 1725. Scholars have used this map to show the many differences between European and indigenous conceptions of space. Europeans mapped territories using the toolkit of Enlightenment cartography. They employed map projections, they imposed consistent scale, they pictured geographic landmarks so their orientations and distances from one another on the map mimicked their orientations and distances and positions in geographic space. The Catawba deerskin map and other native maps operate by different rules. Like other network maps, this one ignored the true distances between places and instead described relationships among peoples. When I teach network maps in my Maps in World History lecture course, I use this as an example, and I use the Washington Metro map as another example of a network map. For many historians, these differences show how the conflicts between European colonizers and Native Americans were rooted in irreconcilable understandings of the world. As Indians and imperialists mapped the native Southeast in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, they misunderstood one another, in part because they spoke different languages, and not only in a linguistic sense. Their notions of property, commerce, kinship, and alliance were so different, this view holds, that these clashing worldviews led to almost inevitable conflict. The English, who settled permanently in the region in 1670, proved especially unwilling to regard native ways of seeing the world as legitimate. By this interpretation, the Catawba deerskin map represents a distinctive form of native knowledge that Europeans ignored in their drive for sovereignty, wealth, and domination. What happened to the map itself suggests such a conclusion. After it was received by South Carolina's royal governor sometime in the early 1720s, it was dedicated to His Royal Highness George, Prince of Wales, who became George II in 1727. The map appears to have vanished into his royal collections, where it may have served as an exotic curiosity. I have found no evidence that it sparked discussion or policy or figured into British Indian diplomacy. Today I want to propose a new way of understanding this map. I believe it was an attempt to communicate important knowledge to English officials about the realities of the indigenous Southeast, realities that they had persistently misunderstood. Instead of seeing the Catawba deerskin map as an exclusively native way of seeing the world, I argue that it was designed to communicate with its English audiences. Most important, it presented a vision of this world that corrected the errors shown on earlier English maps. Despite our desire to find authentic expressions of native sensibilities, we should recognize that this map was created to achieve a diplomatic purpose. My didactic interpretation of the map argues that it was meant to teach the truths about the Catawbas that English maps had got wrong. With these corrections came a message about Carolina's dependence on native allies, native dependence on Carolina trade, and the entangled paths that should connect these two peoples into the future. This didactic interpretation of the Catawba deerskin map begins with a bit of speculation. We know that Catawba Indians traveled to Charleston on multiple occasions. From very early in the relationship, they engaged with English officials as allies and trading partners. I believe it is likely they saw copies of the early English maps of the colony published in London when they came to town. It was commonplace in colonial America to display such maps in public places, including council chambers and courthouses, the very places where you would have negotiations with visiting native dignitaries. The Catawbas spoke a Siouan language, and diplomacy depended on the work of translators, Indians who spoke English, European traders who spoke Catawba. But for natives and Europeans everywhere in North America, spoken words were only one element of a larger process of communication that relied on gestures and material objects, as we heard about a little bit earlier today. When native speakers addressed their audiences, they moved their hands and arms to emphasize their intentions and ideas. One of the more common gestural moves that were made in these negotiations was putting two fingers together in a pattern like this, showing people are connected, they're in amity. It kind of looks like the double lines of the paths on the Catawba deerskin map. One example. When Catawba, so scholars of indigenous cartography, when native speakers address their audiences, they move their hands and arms to emphasize their intentions and ideas. They held objects such as belts made of wampum that embodied the words they spoke. Scholars of indigenous cartography have shown how native mapmaking was one part of a larger repertoire of nonverbal communication. When Catawba diplomats came to town, they discussed strategy, trade, and geopolitics with a combination of words, gestures, and objects. And so I have to confess, we don't have any actual direct evidence that English officials in Charlestown showed their Catawba guests copies of early English maps. But what better way to communicate complex ideas about people and places than to show what was meant by pointing on a map? The map features 15 shapes that represent native and European communities. Linking these shapes together are a network of double lines that stand for paths of connection. The path was a basic concept of native diplomacy. These lines represented actual roads that linked these towns together, but also the idea of alliance and affiliation. The presence of a path connecting two communities promised goodwill and welcome and a commitment to resolve disputes peacefully. At the center of Catawba country was Nassau, also known as Ushery and Esau. We'll get to that in a minute. This is the largest town in the Catawba Confederacy with the most connections. 10 other Siouan towns appear at the heart of this network represented on the map. Just beyond it were 2 other native peoples that were linked to the Catawbas but not part of them, the Iroquois and Cherokees and the Muskogee and Chickasaws. The 2 European communities on the map, Charlestown and Virginia, are represented by square shapes, distinguishing them from the circular communities of native peoples. The map is also a graphic illustration of the material exchanges that animated this network. An image of an Indian hunting, as an English annotator added to the map, pictures a native hunter armed with a European gun to obtain deerskins. The picture of a masted ship off the coast shows the source of European goods for which these deerskins were exchanged. An unidentified figure, perhaps a representation of the Corn Mother in Cherokee and other traditions, presides over the edges of this space. The Catawbas became steadfast allies of the English by the late 17th century. They joined forces with the South Carolina militia to help fight the Tuscaroras in North Carolina in 1711 and 1712. This alliance was broken only once. The Catawbas participated in the Yamasee War against Carolina in 1715 and 1716. So first and foremost, the Catawba deerskin map was a gift, a diplomatic present, delivered in an ongoing attempt to restore peace and commerce after this war. When English colonizers arrived in the Southeast in 1670, the Lords Proprietors of Carolina commissioned maps to proclaim European sovereignty, attract colonists, and reveal indigenous people and places beyond the Atlantic coast. The first such map appeared in John Ogilby's America, being the latest and most accurate description of the world. This book is a hefty work of geography that contains scores of maps, illustrations, and urban views. It was largely a direct translation of an original work in Dutch, but for the English edition, John Ogilby inserted new maps of English colonies, including this one of Carolina. To promote their new colony, Carolina's Lords Proprietors also provided a text description for the volume. It was written by none other than John Locke, who would go on to become a famous philosopher and thinker. They also shared the Lords Proprietors also shared their manuscript maps of the colony with John Ogilby, who turned them over to London engraver John Moxon to create this map. The first English map of Carolina showed the location of the Charleston settlement less than a year after it was founded. The only new information they had about the native interior came from an exploratory journey by a German explorer working in the service of Virginia named John Lederer. Lederer ventured from Virginia into Catawba country in 1669 and 1670, the same year that the first English colonists arrived in Charleston. His expedition's routes reached the towns of the Occaneechees, labeled Akhenaten on the map, Virginia's primary trading partner in the interior. His journey terminated at Ushery, which Lederer described as, quote, more populous than any town I had ever seen before in my march, unquote. Ushery was another name for Nassau or Esau, the most important community and the largest circle on the Catawba deerskin map. When he reached this Catawba town, John Lederer believed he had discovered a new Indian civilization that, in his mind, resembled that of the Incas or the Aztecs. We don't know if the Catawbas knew of Lederer's description of their society, which he published in his own book with his own map in 1671 as The Discoveries of John Lederer. If they did, they might well have been surprised to hear that they practiced human sacrifice and fought with edged metal weapons, including hatchets made of silver, both of which Lederer attested to in his work, neither of which were true. The map located their most important town along a vast interior lake that, in fact, did not exist. The Catawbas would not have recognized themselves in the images that Ogilby added to his map. Ogilby illustrated the cartouches of his maps with native figures. These were loosely based on images of Mesoamericans for the most part, pictured with their distinctive hats and headdresses throughout the volume. In the upper right, we see a native hunter with a large bow and a wolf's head pendant. This was adapted from an earlier image of a Susquehanna warrior, long-standing enemies of the Catawbas, certainly people that did not represent them. Lederer's route from the James River to Ushery would have puzzled a Catawba viewer of this early map. By positioning Ushuri in relation to Virginia, this map distorted the true geography of Catawba country. The blank space between Ushuri and Charleston erased what the Catawbas regarded as their primary geographic domain, the interconnected courses of the Catawba, Wateree, and Santee rivers. These began in the Blue Ridge Mountains and terminated along the Atlantic coast about 50 miles north of Charleston. The map failed to show this river system at all, but it was one that defined the Catawba homeland. And it neglected to show how the separate towns that composed the Catawba Confederacy spread along these missing rivers. On this first map of Carolina, English settlers saw the Catawba as an overland outpost of Virginia. The blank space between Charlestown and Ushuri on the new description of Carolina betrayed a profound English geographic ignorance of the indigenous interior. In 1682, the Lords Proprietors published their second official map of the colony, Joel Gascoigne's A New Map of the Country of Carolina. This map reflected a dozen years of English expansion and experience in the North American Southeast. It shows the emerging plantation landscape spreading along the rivers that flow into Charleston Harbor. Some of the blank spaces on the 1671 map have been filled in with the locations of native communities surrounding Carolina. Gascoigne's map identified 4 primary indigenous sites around Charleston. The Combahee were one of several Muskogean people-speaking communities of the coastal lowcountry known as the Cusabo. Their strategic location between English Charlestown and Spanish St. Augustine made them an important ally. And if you can see, the Combahee, the Westo, Coffeetichequi, and Esau are all represented with standard generic icons for European cities that you could find on European maps of any place in the world. The Westos were recent arrivals to the region, which they had terrorized since 1660. From their settlements along the Savannah River, the Westos sent hundreds of warriors in search of captives for the Indian slave trade. With firearms from Virginia, the Westos struck fear in the hearts of southeastern Indians. When Carolina's Indian agent, Henry Woodward, accompanied the Westos to their settlement in 1674, he described their town as being built in a confused manner. Its ramshackle longhouses bristled with poles that displayed the scalps of those that Westo fighters had killed, and the place was crowded with raiding canoes and young Indian slaves. The Westos were a power to be reckoned with. Their community was a mobile, militarized encampment of slavers preying on their neighbors, the Cusabos, the Catawbas, the Appalachians, the Timucuans, and others. The only interior town that Gascoigne retained from the Lords Proprietors' first map of Carolina was Esau, which was labeled as Ushuri on the original map. Esau stood alone as a representative of Catawba society on this second map, which displayed Esau at the head of the Wateree River. The final native place on the Gascoigne map was Coffeetichequi. Hernan de Soto famously visited the chiefdom of Coffeetichequi during his violent entrada of 1539 through 1542. He and his Spanish troops raided the temple in its territory, taking its stock of pearls as well as stores of maize. When the Spanish returned to the region in the 1560s, they stationed troops in Coffeetichequi, but native people rose up against them, killing 130 soldiers and driving Spain back to its bastion of St. Augustine on the coast. When the English arrived more than a century later, in 1670, they immediately sought out Coffeetichequi. Henry Woodward undertook the colony's first official diplomatic mission just weeks after the first settlers arrived to establish Charleston. After an overland journey of 14 days to the northwest, he claimed to have found it. Aware of the looming threat of Westo raiders and Spanish forces from the south, Woodward, in his words, contracted a league with the Emperor of Coffeetichequi. In 1670, English officials believed they had a military alliance with this fabled tributary chiefdom first encountered by De Soto. It remains unclear who actually visited Charleston in 1672 to solemnize this alliance in a formal diplomatic meeting. But English officials described the visitors as the Emperor of Coffeetichequi with 100 warriors in tow. In 1681, the English and the Westos were at war, and the English contacted Coffeetichequi for assistance. This was the last documentary reference to Coffeetichequi in English records, and there is no record that anyone in Coffeetichequi acknowledged or responded to this request. Although it lingered on in cartography for another decade or two, the chiefdom of Cofitacheque had otherwise vanished. Catawbas looking at Gascoigne's map might have appreciated that the English had enlarged their understanding of the human geography of the North American Southeast. They were beginning to grasp the geopolitics of this fast-changing frontier region. On his map, Gascoigne recognized several types of native peoples. He accorded the Catawbas at Esau with a marker that designated their town as a significant place. But to reduce all of Catawba country to Esau misunderstood their cultural and political community, which was composed of multiple autonomous towns spread along the river. When they looked at Gascoigne's map, Catawba viewers saw Cofitacheque and Esau placed side to side as if they existed contemporaneously as neighboring polities. Gascoigne cited Cofitacheque at the head of the Santee River and Esau at the head of a separate watery river. In fact, these two rivers were branches of the same waterway. Cofitacheque no longer existed as the kind of place that DeSoto had encountered in the 16th century. As this paramount Mississippian chiefdom had collapsed between DeSoto and the arrival of the English in Carolina, its inhabitants scattered and reformed into new coalescent societies, including the Catawbas. The map therefore got it right that Cofitacheque and Esau existed in roughly the same place, but it got it wrong that these places existed in the same time. In 1711, Edward Crisp published his complete description of the province of Carolina. One of its insets was Thomas Nairn's Map of South Carolina, showing the settlement of the English, French, and Indian nations from Charlestown to the river Mississippi. The map documented the Indian agent's audacious 1708 journey into the native Southeast. His bold plan was to expand Carolina's trade in fur, deerskins, and native slaves deep into the continent. By offering better goods at better prices, Nairn's scheme sought to disconnect Indian towns from their alliances with the French at Mobile and reconnect them to a new trading network centered in Charleston. He dreamed of building an unstoppable native army under his command. With it, Carolina might push into territories claimed by Spain and France. Nairn's vision of a greater Carolina was not limited to the rice plantations of the coastal plain. Instead, he pictured South Carolina as a continental empire dominating the Southeast. Nairn's map pictured 22 distinctly named native places. On previous maps, English mapmakers had reduced Indian communities to single sites marked with generic urban icons. Nairn's iconography dispenses with these conventions. Here, he pictures native communities as composites of individual towns, with native house icons arrayed across space in numbers that reflect his population estimates for each place. The map here shows the populous Cherokees with 3,000 men capable of bearing arms spread across the mountain valleys that defined their homeland. 34 house icons give this population statistic some visual form on the map. Like the Catawbas, the Chickasaws were a coalescent society that formed after the collapse of Mississippian chiefdoms that once dominated the Mississippi River Valley. They occupied the upper Yazoo and Pearl River valleys in what is now Mississippi. Nairn and other Carolina traders built an Anglo-Chickasaw alliance that pitted the nation against the Choctaws, France's most important native ally. Nairn's map likewise recognizes the dispersed towns that made up the Chickasaw Nation and proposed establishing a permanent English factory or trading post among them. A Catawba viewer would have appreciated the advances that English mapmakers had made over 4 decades in understanding and representing native places. The map Nairn produced was a collection of sites and paths that resembled the geographic forms on the Catawba deerskin map. And with this visualization, I've simply circled each of the towns mentioned on Nairn's map and highlighted the paths, the roadways that connected them. For the first time, perhaps, the Catawbas saw an English map that presented their world as they preferred to see it, as a network that located communities and the paths that connected them. As much as they might have admired these advances in describing the indigenous interior in general, Nairn's map contained a horrifying omission for them. A glance at the Santee River on Nairn's map shows the presence of French Huguenots who had settled plantations along its banks. But Nairn's map ignored the Catawbas entirely. It erased them as meaningful participants in Carolina's plans for an expansive Indian trade. It proclaimed Carolina's primary allegiance with the Creek Indians and showed how English traders sought to leverage that connection to gain access to new allies in the West. As English traders sought slaves and deerskins from native partners, they fostered a pattern of colonial engagement with the indigenous interior that was highly disruptive to any system of geopolitical order. The widespread Indian slave trade promoted warfare and captive taking. Trade with British merchants meant debt peonage, material dependence, and competition for trade goods. As South Carolina's Indian traders pressed these advantages, native societies pushed back. During the Yamasee War in 1715, a confederation of Creek, Yamasee, Catawba, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and other native groups attacked the colony from all sides. Their attacks demonstrated that the settled plantation countryside around Charleston was only as secure as those in the interior permitted it to be. Raiders from the north and the south forced settlers and enslaved Africans to flee behind Charleston's walls. The Indian warriors killed hundreds, slaughtered livestock, and put plantations to the torch. As South Carolina rebuilt after the devastation, the Crown took the colony over from the proprietors. To stabilize Britain's southern continental frontier, this new royal government built new forts, ended the Indian slave trade, and sought to forge new diplomatic relationships with these Indian adversaries. The Yamasee War destroyed the network Thomas Nairn mapped across the eastern continent. Its first victim was Nairn himself, whose murder by Yamasee Indians initiated the conflict. The Catawbas joined other southeastern Indians in this surprise attack against Carolina. They killed English traders in their towns and sent hundreds of fighters down the Wateree River to attack the colony from the north. In May 1715, Catawba fighters skirmished with the Carolina militia and killed 26. In June, they gained entry to a plantation compound where they killed 19 more colonists. On June 13, 1715, South Carolina's militia attacked this massed Catawba force, which rapidly withdrew up the Wateree River back to the Catawba homeland. By July, the Catawbas sued for peace and agreed to fight with rather than against Carolina. With these native readings of early Carolina maps that I've offered you in mind, we can see more clearly the messages that the Catawbas wished to convey to Governor Francis Nicholson by presenting him with their deerskin map in the 1720s. The Catawba deerskin map proposes a new commercial network centered on the towns of the Catawba Confederacy. This map was never intended to be a comprehensive map of the societies of the Southeast. The chief instigators of the Yamasee War were the Yamasees, of course. The Creek Indians were the larger power, however, that made the war against Carolina possible. Neither of these nations appears on the map at all. And it's not because the Catawba mapmaker didn't know that they existed. The Catawba deerskin map proposed a new view of space, a new point of access into the native interior, one that followed the trails along the Santee and Wateree rivers into Catawba country. Instead of bypassing the Catawbas and relying on the Creeks to reach the Cherokees and the Chickasaws, Catawbas proposed a new route for Carolina's reformed Indian trade that privileged their power and their connections. On previous English maps, the Catawbas saw their confederacy misrepresented. Here, they made clear that their strength and territorial reach came from the unification of 11 separate communities, each of which commanded a length of their common river system, and few of which ever appeared on any English map. The map presented a world that the Catawbas wished for, one in which they served as Carolina's indispensable intermediaries with the native Southeast. To conclude, I'd like to focus on the map's image of Charleston that occupies the left-hand side of the map. The Catawba mapmaker presented English Virginia as a simple square. Instead of using such a shape to represent Carolina, which he certainly could have, instead, Carolina appears as a maze-like grid that occupies most of the left-hand portion of the map. To understand this strange and complicated shape, let me take you on a journey that Catawba travelers made when they departed their homeland along the river to visit Charleston. They followed a long-established trading path along the Wateree River. As they approached the settled plantation districts along the Santee, they crossed the river and followed an overland route toward Charleston. On the Catawba deerskin map, as you see here, this path is marked as the English path to Nassau. As it neared Charleston, this road was called the Broad Path or the Indian Path. We can pick up this trail about 25 miles outside of town on Edward Crisp's 1711 map. 1711 map of Carolina. We can trace the route that Catawbas and other visitors from Indian country took into town on 3 roughly contemporaneous maps. In the lower right is a plan of Charleston from Crisp's 1711 map, which shows the walls and bastions of the fortified city, in place from about the 1680s to around 1730. In the upper right, you can see a detail from George Hunter's Iconography of Charlestown, which was published in 1739. This map is interesting because it shows the outline of this original fortified city, so we can compare these 2 maps to each other. But by 1739, these walls had largely been pulled down, and Hunter shows how the urban grid of Charleston expanded beyond the walled city to fill part of the rest of the peninsula. On the left is our detail from the Catawba deerskin map. At the edge of the early city, the broad path bent as it became King Street in Charleston. Visitors to the walled city were forced to change direction once they reached the intersection of King and Broad Streets. And for those of you who know Charleston, you'll know that King and Broad are the very heart of the old city, where all the institutions of government, religion, and society are based. Once they turned left, they turned east to walk down Broad Street, and this was the only way into the old fortified wall city. You had to cross the drawbridges that provided the only point of entry into the fortified town. Before the walls came down, visitors to the city could make the widest possible circuit around its center by following the path that traced this part of the Catawba deerskin map. By taking this route around Charleston, visitors passed all of the notable buildings of the town, including its churches, the courthouse, the guardhouse, and the council chambers. The image of the masted ship in the harbor just below this route shows that Catawba visitors walked down Bay Street to view the wharves along the Cooper River and the ships anchored in the harbor. So, if this part of the Catawba deerskin map shows the route that Indian travelers followed to reach the city, see its sights, take part in diplomacy, what was represented by the grid-like image above this, outside of the walled city? The Crisp map shows a space beyond the fortifications of the city as a rural place, populated by dispersed plantations distinguished by house icons and fenced-in pastures. The Hunter map shows this space as an extension of the city, with a cadastral grid of property lines defining urban lots. Within the walls of the town, native visitors experienced a space defined by right angles and the rectilinear shapes of brick and wood buildings, lots, and streets. Beyond the walls, they observed a different form of spatial order. In the early 1720s, the west side of the peninsula, beyond the city walls, was more rural than urban. The Catawba deerskin map uses double lines to define paths and roads, and we can see a few double lines in that northern part of the map that I've highlighted. That show the extension of Charleston's streets into this new space. But most of this is defined by an irregular maze of single lines. Unlike the paths on the map, they don't always join together. They're not clearly paths or roadways. So what do these lines represent? What is this weird grid in the top part of the Catawba deerskin's map of Charleston? I have a theory. Native observers noticed the landscapes of plantation agriculture. They saw fenced fields, corn planted in rows, and especially the distinctive imprint made by irrigated rice fields as this crop became South Carolina's staple export commodity. Carolina's native neighbors had frequent opportunities to see these distinctive alterations to the low-country landscape. Before the Yamasee War of 1715, plantation expansion had reached the edges of settled Indian country. Catawbas who traveled along the Wateree and Santee rivers into Carolina could see enslaved Africans working along plantations along the banks of the Santee River, a river they claimed as part of their own domain. They saw how these grids put the distinctive stamp of rice agriculture onto what had been a native landscape. The Catawba mapmaker represented Carolina with this image. It had two parts, an urban grid that represented Charleston and a picture of the plantation countryside surrounding it. This composite image of the urban and rural sides of the colony sent the message that the Catawbas understood what made English Carolina distinctive. It documented the Catawba visits to the city and the talks that took place there. Placed alongside pictures of a ship in the harbor and a native hunter with a European firearm, this map documented the trade that was taking place along the paths that connected Charleston to Catawba country and beyond. The very medium on which this map was painted was a sample of the commodity that made this exchange relationship possible. For decades, English maps had misunderstood and misrepresented Catawba country. By presenting this map of the Southeast, the Catawbas corrected the errors of these early maps and told English Carolinians the truth about who they really were. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. Do we have any questions in the audience?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relevance of the map's orientation. It seems like a pretty Western convention to sort of adopt with one side facing up, but the diagrams are sort of faced all different directions. And so I was curious if how you visualize this map would have been used and presented.
Yeah, so the orientation of the Catawba deerskin map is something I think about a lot. The primary way that I visualize old maps is by georeferencing them and showing them against a base map that shows a modern map. It's a good way to display maps and put them in context for us. It's really impossible to georeference the Catawba deerskin map. On the left-hand side of the map, we have a representation of Charleston and the Atlantic coast. The map, you can tilt it to the northwest on a modern base map, which kind of shows where the Catawba lived. I presented so many maps to you today that I didn't want to present additional maps to clutter the scene. But more recent colonial maps show the if you imagine the border between North and South Carolina, in the interior there's a little square notch that was created when the first Catawba Indian Reservation was made in 1763. So that will give you a sense of where we are in terms of modern geographic space. So it's clear from this map that the distances between that space and Charleston have been compressed and distorted and altered. One of the points I've made today is that the Wateree and Santee River corridor is really the essence of Catawba country. That's how they associate it. That is represented nowhere on the map, so there's no topological reference points to mountains, rivers, elevation, or anything like that. So yeah, in terms of orientation, in terms of schemes of representation, in terms of distances, this map does not follow those European conventions at all. And I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why the English didn't seem to take it seriously in the way I've tried to today, as a genuine attempt on the Catawba's part to communicate the truth about their geography to an English audience. There's no indication that they were able to read it in that way.
That was actually my question. I mean, what a marvelous scheme for communication, diplomatic communication or otherwise. It's plausible, but I guess the question is back to your last statement. Is there any evidence of how any success that this communication had, or was this marvelous presentation a complete bust?
Yes and no, I'd say. So first of all, does it matter if Catawbas really saw these early English maps, as I've suggested they did, or not? I guess to me, that's an interesting conceit to approach it this way, but from what we know about who Catawba Indians were, I've just tried to reconstruct how they might have looked at these maps. So whether they did or not is almost beside the point. And I don't see any documentary evidence that people consulted the map or referred to it or thought it had any wisdom or insight that they could leverage or use in any way. It just sort of disappears. But one thing we know about the Catawba is that except for the Yamasee War, they very early on decided that their way to survive in a world dominated by colonization was to partner with the English. And so in 1763, there's a longer story about why this happened. A much diminished Catawba nation accepted really the first reservation in colonial British America for Native Americans. This was created in 1763. It had 144,000 square acres of land. But at that moment, the Catawbas gave up their autonomy as an independent nation and then really put themselves under the protection of the government of colonial South Carolina. When the American Revolution came, they were one of the few Native groups in North America to side with the American revolutionaries against the British. For maybe obvious reasons, most Native fighters sided with the British, who seemed like the only force on the continent willing to protect their interests. So in that sense, maybe the answer is yes. We know that the Catawba became steadfast allies of the English and then of the Americans. They threw in their lot with these difficult partners and neighbors, and that's really the message of this map. So whether the map caused it, certainly the intention behind it was realized in that longstanding alliance.
Do we know anything about what this map tells us about the, I guess you'd say, the internal organization of the Catawba community? That is, there are, as you pointed out, there are, I guess, 11 circles there representing Catawba. Any word is going to
Peoples,
go.
towns,
Villages.
communities. Yeah.
And some are larger than others. They have somewhat different shapes. Some are more connected to others. What do we know about, if anything, about what this is telling us about that community?
We know a bit, and so I think, and this is something that other scholars have come up with before me, but it's pretty clear that the size of the circles corresponds roughly to the population and or the prominence of these communities, and so the size of the circles matters. The societies with the most connections to other places also seem to have been the most powerful. So this is a very Native North American, I think, way of understanding how power works. It's not necessarily about force, but about connections with other people. And so you can see how Nassau is central in many ways, not only the size of its circle, but its connections to other people. We do have some evidence about some of the smaller circles. A lot of them, for a lot of these peoples, the only thing we know about them is that they appeared on this map. But we do know that the Catawbas, I'm big calling them the Catawbas. The English called them the Catawbas. The Catawbas didn't usually call themselves the Catawbas. They thought of themselves as a composite in which the lines between communities were always pretty clear. And there was no ability of any one circle to dominate the others or to command the others. And so this is the central truth of the Catawba deerskin map. And this is, I think, the thing that Catawba viewers of early English maps would have noticed right away, is that the English tended to reduce Native groups to one place and give it a name. That completely misunderstands who they were as a people. And so this is a coalescent society. It's a society that has reformed after the collapse of Mississippian chiefdoms sometime in the 1500s and 1600s, before Charleston was established. And these coalescent societies often really retain the autonomy of those independent groups. They had their own histories, their own migration stories. All of the core ones spoke a Siouan language, but they were very different from one another. There were conflicts between some of these groups as well. They didn't all remain allied to one another. So I wish we knew more, and I have done what work I can do to track down individual stories of these peoples, but that's basically all I can tell you.
We do have a question from one of our viewers online. Are there other historic examples of similar network maps?
There are. So the one that belongs most closely in relation to this map is a Chickasaw map that also uses this node and spoke network structure, and it was also presented painted on a deerskin to Francis Nicholson. So that's an interesting story, and I think there's a lot to say about that. What it points to is that lots of Native groups in the Southeast, even those that were very far apart from each other and from different traditions, saw this as a preferred way to communicate geographic information. It is really a tragedy for us that so few of these objects survive. We don't have a big sample size to look at, but there are many other maps that follow this structure. Scholars have also looked at an older form of cartography that was literally inscribed on the land itself. So if you analyze some of the mound and earthwork structures that Native Americans created generations before the history we're dealing with today, you can construct an interpretation that views those as maps, that uses the same sort of language, graphic language, to describe them. So we just have such a small number of maps to work from to understand Native cartography. I think for that reason, a lot of scholars want these examples to be pure, authentic, untainted by European influence, but that's almost impossible given what we know about this map and other maps like it. This is a map that wasn't made before contact. It was made to address the challenges of contact. It was made for a non-native audience. So that right away makes it a hybrid map, not just a native map.
I'm curious. I have a vague memory that there have been several other articles about this map. Was it Lou Divorcey wrote about it? How does your interpretation of the map differ from some of the earlier other scholars on this map?
I think the primary difference is that, I'm thinking the name that pops into my head is Robert Paulette, who's written a really good book about southeastern space and Native American colonial relations. Paulette and others really see a stark ontological difference between the kind of knowledge embodied on native maps and the kind of knowledge embodied on European maps. And they see those knowledge systems as really being discontinuous from each other. I've never understood it that way. I've always seen this map as a means of communication. So in that sense, my interpretation differs from others. I don't think anyone, maybe it's because it's such an eccentric interpretation, but no one has really interpreted this grid-like pattern that represents Carolina. And so I think that's something new that I've offered is an interpretation of what these symbols mean and how they relate to the landscape. And no one has at least attempted the thought experiment of trying to imagine what Native people, at least Catawba people, saw in these early English maps. I feel like our field has reached a point, the field of map history has reached a point in which we've really rejected the old style of the history of cartography that used to praise geographic precision and condemn what were regarded as errors or inaccuracy. I think we have a much more sophisticated critical view of what those means. But I am still very attracted to errors on maps. And I want to understand how 17th century colonizers, what was the body of geographic knowledge that they operated from when they established these new colonies, places like Carolina, Pennsylvania, Jamaica, other places in the 17th century. And so that is really my approach to understanding this history is looking at the foundation of geographic knowledge that is represented on the maps, not pointing out the errors to show that they're bad maps or to suggest that maps that came later were better, but to kind of plumb what knowledge they represented.
I liked your visualization of Charleston.
Thank you very much.
We have another question online. Can you comment on the challenges and limitations of georeferencing historical maps? For example, scale, vintage.
Yeah, the visualization work that I do, I developed a visualization platform called MapScholar that accompanied my last book. I work with ArcGIS with students and for my own visualizations as well. And for some people, it seems like it's doing a violence to the map to plop them on top of a modern map, because it seems to say the only way we can understand the historic map is in reference to the modern map. I don't see it that way. I really find that it's a powerful way of visualizing cartography. First of all, if you want to look at multiple maps that are georeferenced on a digital base map, it immediately tells us the differences in scale of those maps when we see them in that form. And most of us have, especially those interested in studying old maps, most of us have a pretty sophisticated geographic reference system in our heads that relate to the modern geography of the world. I like to use that to help people understand what these historic maps mean. So when I georeference maps, I tend not to warp them. I tend not to distort them. I tend to keep them and their integrity in place, even if it means they don't perfectly match up with the modern base map, because I think that really helps people understand them. And I'll keep doing that even though people object.
To what degree are Native people participating in the work that you are doing on these maps?
I have contacted the Catawba Cultural Center in South Carolina, just sort of notifying them that I'm doing this research, and I've had a few interesting discussions. Mostly they've referred me to scholars who've worked on this area. So my approach to this is more archivally based. It's less of a community engagement, but I do like the Native American and Indian studies scholarship that is very much engaged with modern Native people and tries to use their contemporary knowledge to understand these past maps, and I'll continue engaging with it in that way.
Another question online. If the English didn't appreciate the map, why copy it? When were the paper copies of the map made? Nature of the paper, etc. What do the copies suggest about possible English appreciation of the map?
Yeah, so I didn't have time to talk about this today, but you'll see that there's English text all over the map, and I'm assuming that was added to the paper copy, maybe to the original deerskin by an English annotator. So we already know that there's some dialogue between the native creators or presenters of the map and the English recipients of the map. I've yet to see the original paper copy that the library's copy is based on, which is at the British Library. The next time I'm in London, I will take a look at it to see what kind of paper it's on and how it came about. You know, one of the things that so if this map were important, if it were considered a really valuable piece of knowledge for English diplomacy, people would talk about it and refer to it. They don't. What people do in this era, though, is they collect exotic curiosities from all over the world in collections that they then display for the education, amusement, curiosity of their viewers. These are called cabinets of curiosity, and wealthy early modern people assembled them, including kings. And so George II, I imagine the original map was part of George II's personal collection of objects, and perhaps served the role as a curiosity for people, but it was pulled out of the archive that would have been used by officials as they were managing the relationships. But I think this is a good point. It was copied. It was important enough to copy. It was important enough to preserve in that form, and so I think they did maybe recognize and understand that it had maybe more of a value than they knew what to do with.
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
Yes, I have a question about the names on the map. Do you imagine that the original had anything written on it at all, or those are just annotations by those who received the gift?
I mean, I'm only basing this, I mean, the names are rooted in historical realities that are repeated elsewhere. So the spellings can vary, but these are real people that are documented elsewhere. It's certainly possible that a native person who wrote and spoke English could have added those to the map, but I kind of assume that that was not the case. What I do assume, however, that if an English person wrote these names on the map, that there was someone telling that English person what the circles meant and gave some instruction. So in that sense, that carries on that tradition of using the map as an object to further communication. So I'd love to be a fly on the wall and hear that conversation about how this map was first presented and explained, what gestures, what words, what translated phrases were used to convey its intended meaning.
Any last questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I
Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much. I want to thank you, Matt. Max, and thanks everybody for coming and for our online audience. Thanks to the Phillips Society for making these events possible and Washington Map for being our co-sponsor for today's activities.